All right. For those who are joining us, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And when I say evening, I'm based in Chicago. Some of you are based in other parts of the world, so it's probably Monday already. Phil, I know you're in Australia, which is Monday morning. So kind of cool that we're able to do this. And we love connecting with designers. So today's guest is Phil Rose. Phil, thank you so much for being here with us. It's our pleasure and honor to host you. um, Before I dive into who Phil is, Phil, just a little personal story here. But when I was a student, this was prior to social media. um, the really big platform that existed was Core Flat. And so I was very active on there, and I was heavily influenced by three or four designers that were always active on Core Flat. And as a student, those people that influence you are the ones that help you, become a better designer, a better student designer. And so I had, Spencer Nugent was very active, Michael DeTulo was very active. And then Phil Rose you were in there. And I remember as a student, that was, we never interacted on Core Flat, but just the fact that you were very active was extremely valuable to me. And I can imagine what other students found immense value in your work on Core Flat. So I do want to personally thank you for just being you. Because you have no idea of what that meant to me as a hungry student who wanted to be like you and be like Spencer and be like other people. So thank you for that. um,
Thank you. That's super nice to hear.
but now we have social media, and now everyone has access to everyone. So different world now. But let's dive into who Phil is and a little bit about Phil. He's a co-founder and creative director of Alquemy, a boutique industrial design consultancy with studios in San Francisco and Sydney. They design iconic and unique products for the kitchen and the home. Phil has been an industrial designer for over 18 years, during which time he has worked in California and Australia for global brands including Philips, Williams Sonoma, and Breville, to name a few, exposing him to numerous methods of design thinking and design doing. This experience has cultivated a deep expertise in industrial design and product development methodologies, and it defined Phil's own holistic and repeatable design process that transforms uncertainty into opportunity and opportunity into tangible and relevant solutions. So, Phil, thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to host you. And for those who are tuning in, we're excited because Phil has some pretty cool things to share. I do want to say that if you are tuning in uh, during the presentation, please ask your questions so that I can integrate them during the Q&A section of this conversation, and either integrate them in the Q&A or ask them in the chat, but don't hold back. So with that being said, I'm going to give Phil the floor. Yeah, thank you so much, Phil.
Awesome. Thank you, Hector. And thanks for having me on Lens today. I'm excited to kind of talk a little bit about my background and my process. And it's really funny, mate, how the kind of world turns, right? Like, interesting to hear that I had some influence over you as a student, whereas, now, Hector, you're doing so well and you're just creating such meaningful connections with industrial design. And, now, we all look up to you. So cool to have that kind of mutual respect. And again, thank you for having me on today and for everything you do for the community. I'm going to jump in. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Today, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about my background as an industrial designer, and really trying to lead to this point of talking about the design process or the product development process that we use at Alquemy all day, every day. Starting with my background, as Hector mentioned, I've been an industrial designer for 18 plus years now. And the first 8 years of my career, I spent in Australia, obviously born and raised here, studied here and worked here for about 8 years. And something that's really, I think, very interesting about Australian industrial design and Australian industrial designers is we do approach things quite differently. I think over my career, I've tried to understand why that is. I don't know if it's a result of it being a smaller industry. I don't know if it's a result of it being proximity to China means that we have less mechanical engineers here in Australia, so industrial designers need to take on more. I think we could probably kind of talk hypothesis all day around what makes it different. But I want to just kind of jump in and talk about why it's different and how it's different, just to give some context as we lead into the process work that we use. I guess first and foremost, what's really interesting about being an industrial designer in Australia, and this is not necessarily specific to in-house design or corporate design or agency design, it's very much across the board, is as an Australian industrial designer, your role within a project is very, very broad. It can go from the kind of work that you would see being done at creative agencies in Europe and the USA, where there's a lot of strategy work, a lot of brand wayfinding, aesthetic development, insight development. We definitely kind of tackle all of that. But also once we have a design resolved and a direction, it's actually the role of the industrial designer to get that product all the way up to essentially analysis of first off-tool samples. So for example, this steam iron here, which was a product that I designed when I was at Sunbeam in Australia, my role for this particular project, like I said, was not only the front end kind of strategic wayfinding, concept development, making, photorealistic prototypes and really resolving the look and feel of the product, but then we would jump into CAD and be in CAD for anywhere between 9 to 24 months, where we're actually developing every single part, whether it's an injection molding or a casting. For example, the sole plate of this iron, which is where the heat comes from, we even designed the length of the element, and we have this really kind of deep understanding of the development of the entire product. We then work really closely with factories, be it in Asia or Europe or wherever it may be, to hand over 3D CAD and really manage that process of getting them into tooling. But just to give some kind of context around that depth, this sort of large blue polypropylene part in the middle here, for example, every single rib, every single boss, every single draft angle, even down to specifying where the tool opens and closes so that we don't have any visible flash, is really the role of an industrial designer in Australia. I think when I was doing this kind of work, there was often sort of rhetoric that, is this really the best use of time of industrial designers, because engineers are extremely capable of this. But I must say that I'm, with the hindsight now of, this being over 10 years ago, the hindsight being that I feel so confident about my knowledge of how to bring a product to market, it really allows you to have a very clear understanding of where you're trying to get to before you even put pen to paper. So in terms of a process improvement, that really allows me or my studio Alquemy to feel very confident about concept development work and knowing that there's a path into manufacturing. Some other examples of where I think this depth can be extremely beneficial to a design or to a designer. When you start getting that deep into the details of a product, and when you're creating the 3D CAD for mechanisms and entire plastic housings, it gives you an opportunity, I think, to take what makes designers great, which is this curiosity to explore and discover and build it into the back end of the product. And this is one of my favorite examples of that. On the right-hand side is a top view of a stainless steel kettle that I designed, gosh, probably over 10 years ago now. And on the left-hand side is a photograph of the level of fidelity that we would go to in prototyping and really trying to resolve these details before we go to tooling. And this was essentially a 3D printed injection molding tool, or 3D printed polyurethane molding tool. So we actually machined out of a block of nylon this internal core that we then captured in this tool and injected with polyurethane to basically troubleshoot and create this interesting button, which is just a soft switch over a mechanical mechanism on the inside that allows that lid to open. But from a designer's perspective, it gave us the ability to really try and simplify the product, give it this really beautiful, simple design aesthetic. And the only other avenue for doing a button like this would be to have a big part line around that button there. And this depth of expertise in product development and injection molding and, I guess, mechanical engineering really gave me as a young designer the ability to not only create entire beautiful product gestures, but also really have these very lovely details and really have attention to those areas and really think about the craft of the product and how that influences a user's experience in how delightful a product can be. I guess really kind of pushing that even further now, beyond just a simple button. Again, I think this real depth of expertise and really getting into understanding how a product is made, designing a product with manufacturing in mind. When you start to go from learning that and understanding that to actually kind of pushing the boundaries, it allows you to really redefine gestures and create very iconic, simple designs. But again, you not only know how to get from a concept to production, but you're very well versed in sitting there and working really closely with electronics engineers to really figure out how to recreate an entire product gesture. So as an example, this is a glass tea kettle that myself and my business partner, David Knott, designed at Sunbeam a long time ago again. But what was really interesting about this is traditionally for an electric kettle to work, you need to have this, what's called a steam tube, which is essentially probably a 10 millimeter diameter tube that runs from the bottom of the kettle up to the top. And essentially the purpose or the job of that steam tube is to know when there's steam inside that chamber of the kettle, and it actually gets drawn down and hits a switch below, which turns the kettle off. Obviously, if we had to have a detail like that in a glass kettle like this, that was really designed to be beautifully celebrated and even taken to the table, it would start to dramatically affect the overall design aesthetic. So myself and David worked really closely with electronics engineers and actually developed a method of sensing temperature underneath the heater plate and starting to use, and remembering that this is over 10 years ago, starting to use digital sensors and digital switches to actually turn the kettle off. So albeit a very simple, iconic product, there's so much depth in the background. And again, I think that's something that was really important in my career as a young designer, to go to those depths so that you really know what the rules are and how you can break them to influence and make a really beautiful, iconic design. One of the other things, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of thought process I've had over my career around why is Australia different and what makes the designers different. Sometimes I think it's also really heavily influenced by the culture of a team. And certainly when I was working at Sunbeam, I had colleagues there, David Knott, like I mentioned before, who I'm now business partners with, who was an absolute rock star. But along with him, there was probably 5 or 6 other designers that were all just in their prime. We were all kind of in our early to late 20s and just working on developing really, really interesting stuff. We had a culture of design at a kind of mid-level designer sort of space, but also we had senior management who really wanted to encourage designers to try new things and explore and really kind of hone their skills on a path that suits them. And I've included this light here because this was actually a product that David designed when we were at Sunbeam together. And this was something that he was, given the green light to develop. He used the workshop at Sunbeam and would collaborate with the other designers to kind of bounce ideas off one another. And David, from these kind of small beginnings at Sunbeam, where we had this culture that really supported exploration and discovery, David was then able to really build a very established profile in the furniture and lighting space. And I think when you're 20 years old or 25 years old, you don't realize how lucky you are to be in these kind of moments in time where there's a very exciting culture and you're really being pushed as a designer to discover what kind of designer you want to be and what those tools are that you need to use to be that person. I'm not going to get too deep into the, why we changed jobs today, but I'm obviously happy to talk about that in the Q&A section. We all hit a point at Sunbeam where a number of us left and moved on, and I think that was really to try and find our own next step. Like I mentioned, David went off and started building this amazing career in furniture and lighting. I opted to follow a passion of mine, which was to get into the houseware space. I've always really loved the kitchen. I've always been an avid home cook. And for me, designing products in the kitchen and the home is kind of my sweet spot. It has become my sweet spot. And so I went from Sunbeam, where there was this phenomenal culture of design and innovation, to being the only designer for a small New Zealand company called Click Clack, who have worked with Michael Graves and a lot of really interesting designers. They've got fantastic brand equity. They've got a great name. But what I found really pretty interesting and kind of threw me at the time is that if you're not in a culture that supports design across a company level, it gets really difficult to sell in design. So I realized that my 5 or 6 years at Sunbeam, where we were just kind of having these big wins and learning about design and really pushing the boundaries, didn't really come down to the capabilities of one person, but it really was about that unique culture. And so when I went to Click Clack, probably full of a bit too overconfident, I actually found it very difficult to sell in good design. The team at Click Clack were great, and there was not so much the resistance to good design, but it was understanding the tools to make those presentations easier, to justify the choices that you've made. I think going to Click Clack, being out on my own in a very different culture, allowed me to understand that if you're going to be a designer, you need to be able to tell people why the solution is the solution and how you got there. So I really had this kind of massive realization probably 6 or 7 years into my career that I had the skill set that I needed in terms of the tools, 3D CAD, sketching, all of the kind of very practical things. But on the emotional side, I wasn't really equipped to change hearts and minds, to build strategies and to really sell the value of good design into companies. And so I started doing a little bit of soul searching, and moving to the US was something that I'd always wanted to do. I have a lot of admiration for the industrial design culture in the United States, because I think something that American designers are exceptional at doing is crafting those stories and providing meaning not only to the product and the end user, but really collaborating with clients or business partners along the way to let them feel like they're involved in the decision-making process and have a clear runway to a successful product. So I was, as I mentioned, really keen on moving to the US. I'd been kind of hustling here and there, entering design competitions. Hector, this was probably deep in my Coraflot days, really just trying to kind of build this profile so that I could get over to the US, solely with the purpose of trying to learn this other aspect of industrial design that was a clear deficiency in my skill set. And I was extremely fortunate to get a job working for Philips Design in Pittsburgh. And for me, this was really this was exactly what I was looking for. Speaking of culture, the Philips team that was doing home healthcare were, again, a little bit like the days of Sunbeam. It was this team of really adequate senior designers who had worked in a lot of different industries for a lot of different companies. And then you kind of marry that with just that brilliance of what Philips Design is. And it was such a huge education for me. I mean, I've called this slide and the next slide Design Boot Camp, because it really was that. I mean, I went to Pittsburgh, and when I started designing products at Philips, I learned very quickly that those deficiencies were really apparent in the way I approached working with, again, trying to sell in design. And what I loved about Philips, we had a creative director, a guy named Paul McGrory, who he was kind of the framework master. I mean, any stage you were in a project, if you needed to facilitate a workshop or sell in a design or get buy-in from a business group, Paul had just this catalog of amazing tools and processes to help you convince other people of your ideas, to help you sell the design, to help you sell what you've done in a really meaningful way. I love this image here because this was a project that I worked on. Actually, you can, for the design nerds out there, there's Gabe Puerto in the left-hand side there from Balance Design in Cleveland, who's a total rock star. And this was a project that he and I worked on together, which was to develop an oxygen concentrator. And for me, I think this project was less about the outcome and more about the journey, because like I said, we had this amazing opportunity to learn from these seasoned kind of Philips Design legends who worked under Stefano Mazzano, who really had begun to create more of an academic understanding of how to facilitate design. So I was so lucky to get this job coming out of Australia, looking for these particular skills and these particular tools to land on my feet in Pittsburgh at Philips, and really learn that and really kind of rationalize that and really understand that. I guess the real kind of tipping point with my time at Philips is I'm from Australia, where it never ever snows, and living in Pittsburgh was a big shock. We did a couple of winters there, and then thought, I can't do this. I need the sun. I need the sunshine. And so it was around at that stage that I actually got in contact with an old colleague from the Sunbeam days, a guy named Ian Allen, who had started a product development team at Williams-Sonoma, the housewares retailer based in California. And I was approached by Ian to come on board and work alongside him to really help build Williams-Sonoma's first true industrial design internal competency. And for me, this represented something just so exciting. And I think, it was one of those moments where you really sense that the moons were aligning. It was in a category that I loved. It was for a brand that had equity and the ability to launch products. But probably more than both of those things, it was an opportunity to start to really try and redefine what my process is and my approach to design, really taking that platform that I had learned in Australia, which is really the kind of nuts and bolts or the look and feel of design, and then coupling that with all of these great learnings that I had from Philips, which was really about facilitating good design, using good design to build brand, evolving your sphere of influence as a designer to be much more than just one-off products. So Williams-Sonoma really represented this great opportunity to try my hand at evolving this process and creating something really unique. but also a way of that next stage of education for me and for my processes, and kind of trying what happens when I bring these two worlds of Australia and the USA together. I think there was a lot of things that I loved about being at Williams-Sonoma. I think the biggest one was having the autonomy and the trust to just go. And that really saw myself and Ian starting to build product roadmaps, working with buyers and merchants and VPs and things like that, to really understand how we can create a competency that will allow Williams-Sonoma to create their own in-house brand, their own home brand, and do it in a really meaningful way. I think the other thing that I loved about Williams-Sonoma is it was without a doubt the first time in my career that I had this realization about the difference between a product and an object. When I'd worked at Philips, when I'd worked at Sunbeam, when I'd worked at Click Clack, we were really designing products that had a use and a function and a reason for being, which we needed to do at Williams-Sonoma. But the other aspect, that object component that I started to learn at Williams-Sonoma, was when you're designing something that's being sold at such an elevated retailer, it needs to have this sense of feeling and this emotion associated with it. And using the processes and the techniques that I'd learned through my career, we essentially created a really simple design process that allowed us to build strategic roadmaps, visual brand languages that spoke to that requirement of being an object, and really start to blow it out and launch a lot of products and start to have a really big impact on the brand equity. During my time at Williams-Sonoma, I was there for probably 5 or 6 years, and I designed, I think, over 140 products. And I think it was that ability to have this repeatable process, scalable process that really helped us there. This object on screen right now is one of my favorites. It's such a simple product. It's one part of a much broader picture. We developed an entire range of tools and gadgets at Williams-Sonoma with a really clear strategy of each individual product being the best at its one job. And that saw us build this really almost kind of automotive inspired, very sort of fluid design language that would allow us to bring ergonomic needs into a product, but do it in such a way that we can have really kind of clear visual cohesion across a collection. To really kind of elaborate on that a little bit more, those roadmaps and those strategic visual brand languages started to be part of the process of framing a new project. We would get, we'd have great meetings with the buyers and the merchants, and there became this really easy internal means of communication of, okay, we want to have a new product in this category. We want to use the fluid design language, but we want to explore new materials, go. So even being able to narrow the scope of the problem that we're trying to solve became intrinsic to this, this design process. These tools on screen right now is a set of pizza and pasta tools, and you can hopefully kind of see that visual link or that visual reference to the tool on the previous page. This really kind of beautiful sort of, again, almost automotive inspired, very fluid design. But the difference here is we actually used wood for the handle. So you go from having this very kind of calculated form and introducing these really beautiful natural materials and really getting into that kind of in-hand feel and understanding the finish. I remember when I was working on these tools, SF MoMA had just reopened, and I walked in there to have a look around at the new design of the building, and they had these handrails that I believe were probably they were probably a maple wood, but they had this really kind of beautiful matte finish polyurethane coating on them, and it just felt amazing in your hand. And trying to communicate that to a vendor in Asia to replicate that finish proved challenging, but we were really trying to make sure that every single tangible aspect of these physical products was very well resolved and very well considered. And that's that kind of moment of it transitioning from being a product into an object. I think the last thing that I wanted to kind of focus on about my time at Williams-Sonoma before I get into Alquemy and the process and really sort of the crux of this talk is this notion that a repeatable process is not only a really great way for a designer to work or a design leader to influence, it also becomes a really compelling way to build trust from your colleagues or your clients or your bosses or whoever it may be. When I started at Williams-Sonoma, the first project I started working on was silicon spatulas, really simple project. And over time, through building a team and building a process and building trust with the internal stakeholders, we were sort of finally given this opportunity to actually design our own collection of small appliances, which is such a different beast from spatulas. And I think that really is a testament to this repeatable process where you can get your stakeholders to trust what you do because your process becomes more and more infallible, and they trust you to do bigger things, to take bigger risks and to push the brand more and more. It's such a great feeling. And I think it's one of the main reasons why I'm now becoming really kind of obsessed with preaching this idea of an actual process that you use and how it can help you build as a designer and also find people who will trust you and invest in you. Sorry, guys. Okay, so moving now into Alquemy. Alquemy is a design consultancy that I started with an old colleague and a very good mate of mine, David Knott. David was in Sydney when we started Alquemy and I was in San Francisco. And I think both of us were both at a point in our career where we really felt as though we'd achieved a point where we could kind of take this leap of faith and go out on our own and know and have that kind of trust and confidence in our abilities, in our processes, in our experiences to really start to do this on our own for other clients. And I want to talk a little bit today about our process. I think the first thing that's really important about our process is it's not a static set of, it's not phase one, concept sketch, phase two, design refinement. We definitely have means of communication like that around facilitating clients understanding what we're doing, but our process is kind of much more fluid and really looks into these three categories that we know that if we can kind of tick the boxes of these three categories, we are going to have not only a successful end product, we're going to facilitate a really successful relationship with that client, but we're also going to give a bigger strategic picture of the brand or the problem we're trying to solve, whether that's creating a really holistic product roadmap or a really scalable visual brand language. We're really able to offer that kind of plus approach to our clients, which I think is very, very important. Kind of as I was just talking about, our process is not just a path to creating meaningful products. That's definitely a really big part of it. But it's also a tool that helps facilitate either strategic wayfinding, which I'll talk about in a sec, or creative collaboration. The strategic wayfinding to me is really interesting. I think we often talk about how a designer's role is to solve problems, but I think what I'm trying to talk about here with this sort of strategic wayfinding, before you even start trying to solve a problem, you need to actually understand what the problem is. And our design process has a series of tools in place that allows us to have these creative, collaborative conversations with our clients and to really understand what the problem is that they're trying to solve before we go too far down the road. I think quite often when clients come to us, we find ourselves really reading between the lines because I think they're not going to tell you what they need because they don't always know. And I think that ability to collaborate with your client and facilitate strategies that help you understand those problems to solve in that first really kind of precious beginning, that first sort of 5% of a project, can really set you up to be successful and to deliver excellent work, but also to provide your client with longevity and not just solving that one particular problem that they've come to you to solve. So like I said, we've broken down our process into these three categories. I'm going to go through them at a high level. Obviously, there's so much detail that I can go into with these, but hopefully, you know, we can go through some of that in the Q&A. But at a high level, we break the tasks into these categories of rational, tangible, and emotional. So to give some context to that, rational provides us with a broad understanding of category trends and a deep understanding of our client's problem. So to put that in the context of probably some of the more known vernacular that we all kind of collectively share as designers, this is really when we're starting to do competitor audits, really trying to understand the landscape, looking at who the main competitors are, what their value proposition is, what the future trends of this category might look like. I think we're really lucky that a lot of our clients are in the home and food space, so we've got a lot of stored knowledge around those things. But again, this is really trying to understand and put in place all of those really key moments, those key elements of the rational thinking that need to go into executing this product. One example that I think that we like to give when we talk about the rational, we were doing a program for Pyrex in Chicago. And something that came out of this kind of phase where we're really just trying to rationalize the opportunity and rationalize the problem. We started sort of consistently seeing food trends, consumer reviews, competitor trajectories that really kind of helped us understand that, and it's very, very simple, that the Pyrex bakeware is about 1 inch too short to really enable people to use them in a way that people are now working in the kitchen. And such a small little insight that came out of this rational phase, and it wasn't even part of the broader project, kicked off this little side project where they essentially invested in new machinery, new tooling, and re-released their bakeware in a much deeper format. And their incremental sales for those when they launched was phenomenal. So really interesting to see how this rational phase and getting a really deep understanding of the problem and that understanding of trends and competitors can give you some really interesting insights that in some cases can be actionable almost immediately. Tangible, which I think is realistically where we spend most of our time. Tangible leverages immersive research and development to uncover product innovations and define new category solutions. When I think about the tangible space, I think it's almost 90% of an industrial designer's job. It's testing the products. When we're doing a kitchen product, we really pride ourselves on lots and lots and lots of testing and actually getting into we've got a test kitchen in the studio here in Sydney where we actually cook and we test and we experiment and we make wacky little prototypes that can help improve it. And it's really this kind of fluid, iterative understanding of solving the tangible problem. So the first one, which is rational, is helping us understand what the problem is. And this is really wrapping some tangible solutions around it. A great example, this was a coffee maker that we designed for Instapot, which just won an IF Design Award, which we're all pretty excited about. The problem that the client came to us with was quite a simple one, but quite a big challenge to solve, which was essentially we want to be able to create a coffee machine that can use both Keurig cups and Nespresso. There were some products on the market that enabled users to do that. And through our deep testing and our audit and this really rich collaborative relationship with the client, it became really apparent that there needed to be something that was much more user-centric and created a really elevated user experience. The competitor products on the market that could do this often required the user to kind of get in there and to take one cradle out and put it over here and put another cradle in and change a pin. And, you know, the whole thing was really messy. And you almost kind of felt like if you did this wrong, you could, you know, get coffee all over your countertop and it could be a bit of a disaster. You've got all of these disparate components that I would certainly lose. So the first part of this project was really myself and David and another guy who was working at Instapot at the time, going really deep and making all of these little mock-ups and prototypes and user experience kind of breadboard models to try and create an experience that was much more familiar and much more common. Not surprisingly, the actual solution on face value is very, very simple. Essentially, this lever at the top here, the user can pull that. It's got a small mechanism in there that then allows you to open the lid, and you've got your Nespresso pod on one side and the K-Cup pod on the other. But the journey to get there through iterative prototyping, lots of kind of breadboard models, foam core mock-ups to really kind of understand the volume that we needed to get to, that kind of depth in the tangible really gave us a product outcome that was very elegant and very elevated and really simple to use and really, really intuitive. So certainly something that we were extremely proud of. And I think I'm very grateful for my time as a designer early in my career in Australia to know that, you know, we have that kind of skill set and the confidence, but also the kind of tenacity to really sort of push the envelope when it comes to a product archetype to make sure that we're delivering a really elevated user experience. And last but not least is the emotional. And emotional really provides an avenue to add meaning to a product or brand, to build thoughtful solutions that will connect brands with their users. We have started to develop, and I actually was going to talk a lot about this today, but I don't think it's really mature enough yet, nor we might not have enough time. We've started to develop this really robust creative framework that looks really deeply at persona-centric exploration. So this ability of working with brands or working with clients to understand or even frame back to them who their customer is through a real kind of psychographic representation of a real person that we might find on Instagram or might be someone we know or someone within the company. But this persona-centric creative framework allows us to start to design really specifically for a type of person. Typically, we would have 3 distinct personas that would have very, very different needs, but might all be very likely to use the product that we're trying to design. And designing for these particular personas allows us not only to understand their needs and their behaviors, it allows us to understand potential aesthetic trends, brand trends that might be really relevant to the client. And ultimately, again, going back to that idea of collaborating and really bringing the client into this conversation, the persona work really provides this awesome platform for everyone to understand where we're trying to take the brand. There's a lot less ambiguity when you have these really kind of dialed in tools. The example on the page today, there's a project we're working on at the moment, which is we can't show anything for, but I actually think is the best representation of our work in terms of this persona-centric stuff. So maybe Hector, in a year or two, I can come back and show that work. So I chose this program here. This is a startup out of California. two awesome dudes, Tony Leo and Chris Burridge, who had this really interesting vision for trying to disrupt the cookware space and kind of ask this bigger question of, you don't need a 10-piece cookware set. And using that as the nucleus, we really worked very closely together. And a lot of these tools through the emotional path became so valuable for helping craft this brand narrative with these guys, because they were really trying to do something very, very different. But we needed to understand that it still needed to feel familiar and to feel safe and to feel stable and known. So working through some of these more emotional aspects particularly with a startup and with these guys became really valuable, because again, it stripped back a lot of uncertainty as to what we were going after and how we were going to execute brand level communication, visual brand language execution, and really ultimately put a product in their customers' hands that actually make a true difference and something that they can then have a really great connection with. I'm getting pretty close to kind of the end here. And I wanted to just wrap it in a little bow of kind of takeaways, because I think there's a lot of information here. And I think these are almost linked to this particular talk. These are kind of the things that I think I wish I knew when I was a student or even starting out. And the first one is find jobs that give you space to explore and discover. If I think back to my time at Sunbeam working with all of these awesome dudes in this really great culture, we were really fortunate that we were allowed to just explore. We were allowed to try to define our own path to success along a project. It was not this cookie cutter moment of having an overbearing design director kind of telling you, here's the language, here's the innovation, just go and execute. It was very kind of exploratory and really allowed us to discover. And I think having that moment at Sunbeam early on taught me that if I didn't have that in a job, I needed to leave. And I know right now at the end of, the start of 2021, the end of, 2020 being one of the hardest years for employment and stability. I want to be really cognizant of that before I make this next statement. But if you're working in a job where you're not getting the ability to explore and discover who you are as a designer, and you're stagnant and you're just sitting there doing someone else's work, leave. Try and find jobs that give you space to explore and discover. It's really, really important. And I think the other caveat to that is research who you want to work for. I became a total agency nerd when I first moved to the US, because I just had this mission of figuring out who I wanted to work for to learn the skills that I need. And I would encourage every designer out there, whether you're a student or you're 20 years in, look at who is going to give you the best place to learn and go there. And when you're not learning anymore from that place, go somewhere else. It's really important to continue to go. Which brings me to the second takeaway of don't stop learning. I think as designers, we all fall into this trap. There's some emotional aspects to being a designer. I think we're kind of oxymorons in many ways, that we don't really want to put ourselves out there. But at the same time, we really want to be engaged, and we want to be learning, and we want to be discovering new things. But I would say value that idea of getting yourself out there, getting in touch with guys like Hector, being involved in these kind of things, constantly trying to push through the job that you have and the work that you're doing, that you're always learning new skills. We have a guy that works for us, Richard Harrod, who I think is a great example of this don't stop learning. Richard had his own startup called Birdie that was this really beautiful kids speaker. And through that, Richard, who worked at Breville, really had this very clear understanding of what he needed to do to get a product to market. And through Birdie, he really immersed himself and continued to learn this journey of moving from appliances to consumer electronics. And what's really valuable about that for Alquemy as an agency is we've got this guy now who is so capable at building prototypes, proof of concepts. There's almost no challenge too great for, you know, you'll sort of throw out an idea on a Friday afternoon, and Tuesday afternoon you've got this kind of Frankenstein 3D print on your desk of there it is, there's your proof of concept. And I think that's the result of Richard's journey of don't stop learning. I don't think the outcome for everyone is always going to be the same, but I think this idea of never stopping trying to gain new knowledge will really enable you to craft yourself as a really powerful designer that can add a lot to a team. And then lastly, use all of this to create and evolve your own unique process. I understand kind of the hypocrisy of me saying this, but I actually think every designer should define their own process. As I sit here telling you about mine, I'm certainly not suggesting that the process that we use is the right process for you. But I think if you follow those first kind of two, don't stop learning and find jobs that allow you to discover and explore, throughout that whole process, throughout that whole career and that whole journey, be really cognizant of how it impacts how you work, and almost become quite dogged about writing these things down and writing down what you've learned and how it influences your process and how it can help you evolve that process to bring a lot of value to yourself as a designer and to the rest of your career. So thank you guys, and looking forward to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Phil. Appreciate that. Do apologize. My light is like really bright. So there's no winning here. I turn off the light, it's dark, whatever. Anyway, let's jump into the Q&A. So for those who are tuning in, again, if you have any questions, please shoot them in the Q&A so that we can, ask Phil. But we can kind of get started. Very inspiring journey that you have here. You were in Australia, you came to the States, and you worked in San Francisco, which is one of the most competitive design markets to work in. And then you worked in the East Coast as well, Pittsburgh. I want to know, since you have this experience of working in Australia and then now working in the United States, I know those are two different markets, two different demographics, but what are some biggest obstacles that you needed to adapt when you came to the United States to be here and stay competitive and also learn at the same time? I know a lot of our audience are from other countries, and a lot of them have a lot of interest coming to the United States to work here. What are some tips you can give them?
Yeah, awesome question, mate. I think I still remember my first day working at Philips in Pittsburgh, which was a pretty daunting day, as you can imagine. And I remember sitting in on a presentation that one of the designers was doing. They just designed a nebulizer that was beautiful, and we were having this really kind of in-depth design review around the product and the emotion and the experience. And I remember kind of stopping in the middle of the meeting and kind of holding up. He had this really beautiful model made. And I'm like, oh, you've got an undercut there, so you can't actually injection mold that handle. And in Australia, that would have been a perfectly valid conversation. However, in the context of where I was working at Philips Design, I didn't really understand at that stage that the role of this model was more to try to facilitate a vision than necessarily dictate an execution. So I think, to answer your question, mate, it's really trying to really rapidly read the objective of the team or read the objective of the moment and kind of show up for that. I think as a designer, if you're not evolving your process, it's really easy to get stuck in a way of working. And I think it goes back to that idea of constantly evolving. And I think you evolve by being put in these situations that are a little bit uncomfortable and you might be a little bit out of your depth. And certainly in this instance, I went home that day, I kind of took stock and I'd read the room and I realized, okay, design is different here and I need to be thinking about it from a higher level and not so tactical. So I think really just understanding the objective of the team and how that influences the work and the culture is probably my number one advice there.
That's a very good answer. We have another question here that came in through a Q&A, and this is from Dylan, and he wants to know if you've ever encountered the tall poppy syndrome growing up in Australia, and if so, how are you able to adapt to dealing with it in the industry? So I actually have no idea what that tall poppy syndrome. So maybe you can give us
Yep,
the
absolutely. It's the tall poppy syndrome is an unfortunate part of Australian culture. I don't really quite know what societal influences made it a thing, but essentially, Hector, a tall poppy syndrome might be, you might come to me and be like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to start my own design consultancy, or I'm going to be great at a thing. And people all go, you can't do that. You're not going to succeed. You're the tall poppy and you're kind of getting cut down. And it does happen here. It is an unfortunate part of our culture. But to answer Dylan's question, Dylan, 100% mate, I've experienced the tall poppy syndrome. I still experience it day to day. And I think what's really interesting, having lived in the US, where you have the opposite. Hector, if you came to me and I'm living in San Francisco and you're like, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to call it advanced design, I'm going to create a community, I'm going to build a whole network, everyone in the room is going to be like, awesome, man, how can I help? Let's go. Whereas in Australia, it might be, well, I mean, why? And can you? And is it important? And I think those two kind of cultural differences, and for you, Dylan, and hopefully you're actually here in Australia, mate, I think having come back and spent close to a decade in the US, I do think that is changing. I think there's a changing tide in Australia that there is more openness to trying things. I've actually been really pretty impressed by the startup incubator community here in Australia. So Dylan, I think it's probably more about trying to find those people in Australia that have kind of said goodbye to the tall poppy syndrome and try and work with collaborators that are going to say yes to you, because you can do it. I mean, I certainly experienced it when I moved from Pittsburgh to San Francisco. I was completely blown away at how many entrepreneurs you would meet. You know, even in our apartment building, there was a guy that was working on this app, and we, hung out with him and he was telling me about it. And I was really thinking, like, what an amazing city to live, where this guy's not only got the capabilities, but he's also got just the emotional confidence to go for it. And it's because he's in a culture that provides that motivation. So even though the broader Australian culture doesn't always support that, there are little areas and little niches and groups of people that will get behind you and really help you kind of push and grow. One of the things I'm hopeful about is that we can also change the landscape of Australian design. I think the more of these talks that can happen, the more community growth that can happen. I think Australian designers are some of the best in the world because of that background. And if we were given a platform where there was no tall poppy syndrome, we could do awesome things.
Awesome. Thanks for really clarifying that. It totally makes sense. And it must be really frustrating to be here, and there's this very strong entrepreneurial like spirit here that you can do anything and you can accomplish so much, and then go back to Australia and just there's not a lot of support.
I think in many ways it could be disparaging, but for me, and at least I know for the guys that I work with, it's actually a great motivation to try and change that.
Yeah.
Because again, and it is changing even without significant influence. I think the drive to really put a spotlight on Australian design and how it can influence the startup community is something that we're really passionate about. So I think in some ways, mate, it's actually kind of what gets us out of bed in the morning and wants us to kind of have a bit of a change of that tide.
That's awesome. I have a couple more questions and we can kind of wrap this conversation up. This question is, as someone interested in breaking into the housewares and kitchen tools category, would you have recommendations on any skill sets that are high in demand today? Do these match the skills that help you early on, or has it changed over the years?
Really interesting question. And I think and it's an interesting thing to talk about, skills and things that are really specific to particular categories. And my answer to that would be 3D CAD surfacing is your best friend when you're in the housewares, tools, gadget space. And I want to kind of back that up with a comment. I remember watching years and years ago, there was this really interesting documentary about Philippe Starck and his design process. And one of the things that really stood out to me in that whole process was his collaborative relationship with his model maker. So back in the day, Philippe Starck had a model maker who would work really closely with him. And this was all kind of hand-carved, automotive-esque in many ways, either clay or foam. And the realization I had was that there's this bridge between an idea and a meaningful product. And it's really that kind of sculpting, how you create the proportions, how you create the form, how you create the surfaces, how it influences the in-hand feel and the weight and all of those really tangible components. And what I realized through this documentary about Philippe Starck is that we live in this really fortunate time where now we have access to amazing 3D CAD packages. And I think in many instances, we look at 3D CAD as an execution tool, where certainly in my experience and in the houseware space, when you're doing hand tools and things where you're sculpting every day, these 3D CAD packages are often the most creative tool that you have at your arsenal. That's how you can sculpt these really beautiful, elegant surfaces. So for that question, number one skill in housewares, I think, would be really robust 3D CAD sculpting abilities. It sounds dry and maybe not like the most interesting response. There's definitely a lot of strategy stuff that you need, but certainly for me and my time at Williams-Sonoma, that was when I think I went from being good at CAD to being amazing at sculpting CAD. And that for me has then just set me down this path of being able to work really quickly and deliver really mature, really well, very thoughtful 3D object-based solutions.
That's a great answer. Especially in the space of housewares, it is so competitive, right? So you have to be able to master something like CAD to really pump out a lot of these concepts out.
I just want to add one more thing to it, because I've just thought about the next part of that skill would be just 3D print everything. We just finished doing a set of toddler cutlery, really beautiful flatware for a Spanish client. And I think we probably did 30 revisions via 3D print to get those surfaces right. And that's the part of that Philippe Starck model maker that we're even more beneficial to have now, as we've got the CAD sculpting abilities, but then we can print these parts and actually feel them. And we were kind of going through this iterative process on this flatware where we would sculpt and then print overnight and come in the next day and go, nope, and sculpt and print and sculpt and print and sculpt and print. And it was just a very iterative way to achieve that kind of place of perfection that we wanted to get to.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have one more question for you. And this question is about, your company that you run with your partner. After working for other studios and other consultancies, now that you're working for your own consultancy, what is one of the most exciting things about having your own thing?
I think it's probably twofold, mate. I think The first one is what we're talking about today, which I really geek out on, which is kind of rationalizing that process, creating a really clear path that enables you to collaborate and build a really meaningful relationship with your clients to deliver work that everybody is proud of. And I think having our own agency is really allowing us to do that. I don't have anyone telling me how to work now, which is such an amazing sense of freedom. I think the other part of it that I really, really love, and it's something that we don't have a lot to show yet, is it's actually allowed us to get to step outside of housewares and to step outside of, I think, what myself and David and even Richard's portfolio are all really representative of housewares and appliances. But what we've been able to do with Alquemy is tell a really clear and concise story around our process and how that can be taken from any category or any industry and really nicely dovetailed into another. So right, now we're stepping into consumer electronics and furniture and, lots of really kind of interesting spaces, really kind of even just exploratory stuff around materiality. So I really love that Alquemy affords me these abilities to go after opportunities that are outside of our comfort zone. Whereas when you're working internally or for someone else, you don't often have the ability to dictate where you want to go and what you want to work on.
That's very exciting. I feel like I can relate to you. I think once you start something of your own, you have this autonomy of like, oh, I can go, I can be really creative without any of the red tape or nothing really holding me back. But then you also know what you got to do. And I think with everything that you do, there's risks and there's rewards, but there's just something so exciting to get up in the morning with that purpose of like, wow, I own this, right? And I think that's it's pretty hard to do, but also very exciting. So kudos to you.
Thanks, man. I think the other thing that I like about it is you can choose what you're distracted by. When you work for a big company and there's a lot of people around you, there's all of these other aspects of politics and dress code. And, as a designer, I think it's really important to get so laser focused on solving that problem in a meaningful way that if I can forget about all of the other distractions of politics and all of that kind of stuff, it just gives you this kind of focus and tenacity to do that thing really well.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our time together. Phil, thank you so much for your time and your insights. For those who are tuning in, please follow Phil. He's online. He's doing amazing work in Australia, which is very exciting. So this recorded session will go on our YouTube channel. So if you want to reference it later, but other than that, Phil, appreciate your time. Great to connect with you. And thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great start to their week. So
thanks, Hector. Take care, man.
Take care. Till next time, everyone.
Cheers, mate.